Good afternoon to everyone. Let's make a start. So, to review what we would have covered so far, remember we're looking at programming this term. I already explained to you guys how to create your problem statement. We already looked at what is a problem statement, how to define a problem. We looked at what is an IPO chart, and that is also something you need to start for your SBA. Now, after the IPO chart, you're supposed to start working on your pseudocode. That's currently where we are at. So I would have explained to you guys the parts of the pseudocode. Your pseudocode has a title. Then after that title, there's a declaration section. Then after that declaration section, there's an initialization section. Then after that, you have your body, which is going to contain all the other statements, your input, your output, your calculation, your loop, your if statements, all the other statements are going to be in the body. And then the final part of your pseudocode is to have that end or stop keyword. So that's the general layout we already looked at. You guys already practiced how to create a basic pseudocode. You already practiced how to use the nested if condition, the nested if statement, which is something you'll need to add to your program. And the final statements we were looking at is the loops. We started with the while loop last week. When it comes to the loops, there are two main types of loops. Anybody remembers what they are? Two main types of loops. Not while and repeat. There's two general categories that we can classify loops under. Anybody remember anything? I'll give you a hint. Yes, Nathan.
Can you repeat the question, sir?
The question is, what are the two main categories of loops, the two main types of loops? The three loops that we're going to look at, they can be categorized into two types, into two categories. What are they? The while loop, the repeat for loop. Yeah.
Is that what's on the screen now? The while loop and repeat loop?
No, those are examples. But there's two categories where we can classify those loops under. The while and the repeat falls under one category, and the for loop falls under another category. That's one of the first things we would have looked at when we started with loops. Basically, one category is when we do not know how long the loop should run for. And the other category is when we do know how long the loop should run for. Anybody remember anything like that?
Isn't the part with definite and indefinite?
Right. Those are the two categories. So those are the two types of loops, or we can categorize our loops, our loop statements. That's one of the first things we will have looked at. That there are two types of loops, the indefinite loop and the definite loop. Indefinite loops, you use those statements or those loops when you do not know how long the loop should repeat for, how long the loop should run for. So if you don't know if the loop should run for 5 times, 100, or even no time at all, 0, then we use an indefinite loop. When you do not know how long it should run for, you use an indefinite loop. But when you do know how long it should run for, that's when you use what is called a definite loop. Because you definitely know you want it to run for 5 times. You want it to run for 1 time. You want it to run guaranteed for 100 times. So an example of the definite loop is the for loop. And two types of indefinite loops are the while loop and the repeat loop. So those are the three examples of loops that you need to remember and the types that they fall under. Any questions from anybody? Another thing we would have looked at is the four parts of a loop. The four parts of a loop. All loops contain these four components. One, a variable to monitor the loop. There's always a variable. Remember, we would have learned what is a variable. Anybody can remind me what's the definition of a variable? Anything that you remember, was a variable? Or even what you remember from maths, was a variable? Nobody?
It stores values.
It stores values. That's simple. A variable stores values. That's simple. So the same thing that you would have learned in maths about x and y variables. They can contain any value. Similarly, in a program, a variable can contain any value. So in this case here, for a loop, you use a variable to contain a value so that you can monitor the loop, so that you can know how many times the loop would have run for. And in this case, what we do basically, we use the value in a counting manner. So as you can see here, in this case, we have a variable called count, and we give it a starting value of 0. So that means it's starting off with 0. Now, at step number 3, notice a simple formula. We have count, which is going to have 0 inside of it. So count plus 1. So that's basically saying 0 plus 1. So remember, this count is a variable. It has 0 inside of it. Think of maths right now. A simple formula. Count, which has 0 inside of it, plus 1. And where do we store the value? Back inside of count. So count was now updated. The value changed from 0 to 1. And by repeating this pattern, when we repeat the loop, it's going to be 1 plus 1. And that gets stored as 2 inside of count. When we repeat the loop again, it's going to be 2 plus 1. And then that 3 now is going to be stored into count. So if you notice, it's basically counting. It's incrementing by 1. So by doing this here, this pattern of adding 1 to that variable every time the loop runs, we are basically indicating how many times the loop would have run for, or would have run for. Think you guys clear on that? Or anybody confused? Are you guys clear?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. Once again, one of the 4 parts of a loop is a variable to monitor that loop, to know how many times the loop is going to run for. How do we monitor it? At step number 3, that's where the update comes into play, updating that variable. By updating it, adding 1 to it every time the loop runs, we basically know how many times the loop would have run for. And I think I would have explained this last week, or when we were talking about it. in the exam, they might ask you a question along this line. What value a variable might have, maybe the second time or the third time the loop would have run for. So this is where being careful and tracing that pseudocode, taking your time, tracing that pseudocode, going it step by step, documenting all your variables, this is where that's going to come into play. So you have your updates. Now all loop is going to have a body. That's basically just whatever steps you want to be carried out. Whatever input, whatever processing, whatever statements and so on, that's going to be inside of the loop. Basically whatever you want to repeat. And then the final component is a test. You're testing now to see whether to stay in the loop or whether to exit the loop. Those are the 4 parts of a loop: the variable, the body, the update, and a test. 4 parts a loop contains. So that would have been this here we would have covered so far. Any questions from anybody? Anything you're confused about? So remember, variable, test, body, and update. Those are the 4 parts of all loops. If no questions, what else do we look at as a recap? You need to remember the 4 differences between the while loop and the repeat loop. They will test you on at least one of the difference. It might come in a subtle way, you might even recognize it, but they will test you on it. The first difference is, where is the test? So remember, a loop has a test. Where is the test? In the while loop, the test is at the beginning. So remember, imagine a gate. You're entering maybe a garden, or you're entering a house. The test is at the beginning. You enter the gate is at the beginning, blocking you from entering the garden. Now, the repeat loop, the test is at the end. So you're free to walk in the garden for a repeat loop. But at the end of the garden now, as you're walking through the garden, at the very end, there's a gate there, blocking you from exiting. That test is at the end of the repeat loop. So it's either going to block you in, so you have to circle back around the garden, or it allows you to leave that garden. So that's the first difference. Where is the test? At the beginning or at the end? Now, where is the body? The body is basically the opposite of the test. So if the while loop has the body at the beginning, then if the test is at the beginning, the body is going to be at the end, or basically after the test. So it's like you enter the gate, you get into the garden is the body. Now, the repeat loop, the body is at the beginning. So you already enter the body, you already enter the garden. And the test is at the end to know whether you should exit or remain. Number 3, the test has to be true. So the third difference is whether you stay or exit the loop. What's the condition? Does the test have to be true or false for you to exit or enter? What is the case? Well, for the while loop, the test has to be true to enter or stay inside of the loop. So once it is true, you stay in the loop. You enter the loop, you stay inside of the loop. Once it continues to be true. Anytime it's false, you exit. So let me add that to the end there. False equals exit. Now, the repeat loop is going to be the opposite. The test has to be true to exit. So the repeat loop is going to be true to exit. So that means it's going to be false to enter. Or in this case, to stay inside the loop. Because there's nothing stopping you from entering, so I shouldn't put enter. I should say stay inside the loop. There's nothing blocking you from entering. Remember, the test is at the end. So if you reach the test now at the end and the condition is false, you are going to stay inside of the loop. The test has to be true in order for you to exit the loop. So if you notice, whenever we run a test is usually going to have this pattern here. What I have highlighted here, step number 4. A test is usually going to have this pattern. Whether something is greater than, whether something is less than. It's like if you're asking a question, is count greater than 10? Is count equal to 5? Those are usually the pattern of tests. Greater than is a comparison you're basically doing. But you can ask it in a question format to better understand it. So usually when we have a test, in most cases, we're checking for the true condition. We're focusing on the true. So once you remember the true, the reverse is for the false. So the while loop, if it is true, you stay or you enter the loop. But for the repeat loop, once it is true, you exit. And the opposite for the false. Now the final difference. How many times can the loop run for? What is the probability of that loop functioning? Well, the while loop has the possibility of never running. Why? The test is at the beginning. So if you get false all the time, every time you run that test at the beginning, you will never run the loop. You will never enter the loop. So that's why it has a possibility of never running. Now, the repeat loop has the possibility of running only once. Why? Because remember the bodies at the beginning, you're running through the garden and then you're going to reach the gate at the end. So you complete the loop at least one time. And now if the condition is true, you exit the loop and you're gone your way. You would not return back to that loop. So there are certain cases where you only want the loop. There are certain programs, there are certain cases where you only want the loop to run when a certain condition is met. Only in that condition. Maybe you want the loop to run only if the person gets a grade greater than 80. Only if the person enters an age greater than 60. So that's the purpose of the while loop. It's guaranteed of running only when your condition is met. If it's false, you're guaranteeing that it is never going to run. That's what you want out of that program. But the repeat loop, you want it to run at least one time. You want it to do something. Even if the condition is not met, you just want it to run at least one time. Maybe the loop has the purpose of displaying something, outputting something. It does some form of calculation that you need. So you want it to run at least this one time. Maybe it's like the repeat loop could be like a program for a cashier. Maybe the person only bought one item. So you enter that one item and the person no longer has any other item. Just one item the person bought. So the loop ends there at least one time. And it outputs the person's receipts. So that just could be one example there. So it's just to remember those 4 differences between the while loop and the repeat loop. Are we clear so far?
Yes, sir.
Any questions, any concerns, any comments from anybody?
No, sir.
Applications. Stephanie, you good so far?
Yes, sir.
All right. I would have sent a while loop activity for you guys to complete I haven't seen anybody completed that. Well, only one person did. Remember, you will see these in your exam. So practicing and understanding how they work will benefit you. And more so for your SBA. We're just gonna go back over this example here of the while loop, and then we're gonna start the repeat loop. Because we already covered while, but just as a recap as to how the while loop works. So at the very beginning, we have a title. Remember, that's always part of a pseudocode, having that title. Now, here we have some initialization. We have total equal to 0, count equal to 0, average equal to 0. Here, step 1, we have output. Enter a mark. So anybody can tell me what term would we use to indicate the action being carried out here? That's actually a question in an exam paper. And I think I mentioned it in the class when we were covering this example. It is a term that we can use for describe the action that is being carried out here. There's a particular action that is being carried out here. It starts with P. PR.
Is it print?
No.
Processing?
No. But you're close though, Nathan. Output, print is another term for output. So somewhat related, but not the correct answer I'm looking for. PRO. PROM. PT. Prompt. This is called a prompt. Basically, you are requesting something. So, when you have a program and the program requires the person to type in something, in order for the person to know what to do, you need to prompt the person. You need to tell the person what to do. That's the purpose of step number 1. Telling the person what to do. It's called a prompt. So in this case here, you output a phrase. Please enter a mark. Please enter a value. Please enter the next item. So by telling the person what to do, telling the person where to type, you are prompting that person, telling the person what to do. Every time you're going to accept the input, every time you use the keyword input, there must be an output before it. So technically, there must be a prompt before an input, instructing the person what to do. So it shouldn't just be a blank screen, because whenever you have an input, you can technically see a blank cursor blinking, a blank line like this here blinking on the screen. When we get to programming, you might see it, or maybe you've already seen it. But in programming, whenever we input something, a blank line would always be blinking on the screen to indicate that it's ready for you to accept the input. But the person may not see it, and the person may not know what to do. So we have to prompt that person. Good. Hope you're clear on that one there. So step number 1 is called a prompt. Step number 2, we are going to input a mark. So the person enters maybe 80. Now, step number 3, our loop. Now we have to know where our loop starts from, where our loop ends. And it's simple. The end while is that indication. Now, while mark is not equal to -1. That's our test. So mark has a value of 80. So while 80 is not equal to -1, and this might be confusing to some person to try to figure out. That's why I would usually say ask it in a question format. Is 80 not equal to -1? And that is true or false?
True.
True. So 80 is not equal to -1. That's true. So 80 is not equal to -1. That is true. -1. So we have our answer of true. We run the tests, and the output from the test is true. Now, what do we do when a while loop is true? This is where the differences come into play. While loop, the test has to be true to enter or stay in the loop. So, once the condition here is true, we enter the loop. So we have permission now to run the body. So step number 4 is to take total. What does total have? Total has 0 inside of it. Add it to mark. Mark has 80. 0 plus 80, and we take that and store it into total. Now if you notice, this here is another example similar to count plus 1. It's a mechanism that we use to increment or update a variable. So whenever we want to basically add something together, like instead of saying, instead of having 10 mark, so like for instance, mark 1 plus mark 2 plus mark 3 plus mark 4 plus mark 5 plus mark 6. So add 10 marks together. That would be inefficient to write it that way. That would be inefficient. So this is where the loop comes into play. So instead of running the program, say enter the first mark into mark 1, enter the second mark into mark 2, that's too much code. That's too much instructions. By running the loop, it makes it easier. How? By having this simple pattern here that I have underlined. You take a variable, one variable, and you constantly add that value to another variable. So it's like if you have a big bucket and you have a small bucket, and every time you enter a grade inside the little bucket, you throw it into the bigger bucket. That's basically what's happening here. So you enter the grade into mark, and then you take it and store it into total. And by doing that, it keeps adding up all the time. So when you enter the first mark, this is 80. 80 goes in here. When you enter the next one, maybe 60, 60 gets added on to that 80, and it builds up like that. And that's basically what this mechanism here, this formula, is carrying out, this action here. So, hope you guys understand that, because you'll see it quite often. So now 80 plus 0 gets stored into total. Now, step number 5, we have an update. So remember, this entire thing is our body. So if you notice in the 4 parts, we have our tests, we have our update, we have our body, and what's the other part that we're missing? Remember, it's 4 parts. Test, body, update, Nobody can remember the fourth one? We just looked at it. Sad that nobody even making any notes. The other one is your variable. So we have the test, we have the update, the body, and the variable. So in this example here, can anybody tell me which variable is being used to monitor the loop?
Ether.
Can you repeat?
Ether.
No, the variable. Which variable?
Mark.
Mark. Good, that is correct. Mark is the variable that we're using to monitor the loop. How do we know it's Mark? Any idea, Luciano? Or anybody else? How do we know it's Mark? Why did we choose Mark?
Sir, because it's in the test.
Good, very good. That's the correct answer. Because that is the variable we are testing. So whatever variable you are testing, that is the variable that is monitoring the loop. So our update in this example is just an update. But in the other example that we were looking at, this one here, this one has the same variable for the update and the test. So count, in this case here, is being used for both the update and to monitor. It's carrying out two functions. But in this example here, mark is being used for the update. Why? Because that's the variable in the test. Like in this case here, count is the variable that is being carried out for the test. But in this case here, count alone is being updated. So step number 5, we have count plus 1. That's going to be 0 plus 1. And then 1 gets stored inside of that count variable now. So that variable gets updated to 1. Step number 6, we have output, enter a mark, and then input. The person has to now type in a mark. So say for instance, the person now types in 60. So we go back to the top. Remember, this is a while loop. The test is at the beginning. We got to know now whether we are allowed to enter back into the loop or to exit. So when we go back to the top, it's going to be 60 inside of mark, and then we ask the question, is 60 not equal to -1? That's going to be that there, 60 not equal to -1. Once again, that is going to be true. So we're allowed to enter into the loop. So now it's going to be 60 for the mark, because we have to go to step number 4, and 80 inside of total. So we take the 80, add it to the 60, and we're going to get 140. Now, step number 5, remember count was updated, so it's going to be 1 plus 1. And that's going to give us a 2 over here. And then output, enter a mark. Now, this case here, what's basically happening is that the person set it up in such a way that when there is no more mark to enter, you simply type -1. They set it up with a mechanism basically to end the program, to know when to end the loop. Not the program, to know when to end the loop. So in this case, the person maybe stopped at 2 grades, so they enter the -1 now. So they know when it goes back to the top, it's going to be -1 is not equal to -1. Is -1 not equal to -1? And that's going to be false. And what do we do when the while loop is false? We exit that while loop. So remember, that's the false.
Sir, you could run back step 4 and 5.
Run back step 4 and 5. All right, so step 4, it's a simple calculation. You're going to take the two variables on the right hand, total and mark, and you added them together. So in this case here, maybe the person would have entered 60 into mark. So at the top here, we have input mark. And then even at the bottom here, we also have input mark. So that means the person has to type in a value and it gets stored in the variable called mark. So as you go through the loop, whatever the person would have typed in this example, maybe the person typed in 60. Now, total, whatever value total has, is going to be added to that mark, whatever value it has. So in this case here, total has 80 inside of it. Because of the previous loop, we entered 80 before, and mark has 60 inside of it. So now when you add the two together, we get 140. So now total is going to be updated with 140 here. So 80 plus 60 gets added together, and you store that 140 now inside of total. So the next time the loop goes around, it's going to be not 80 here, it's going to be 140. And then maybe the person now enters, type in 160. So now it's going to be 160 plus 140. And that answer now gets stored into total, which is now going to be 300. Clear on step 4? Amelina?
Yes, sir.
Clear on step 4?
Yes, sir.
All right, step 5 now. Step 5 is the same process as step 4. It's what we use to count our count the loop. This is what we use to count the loop. That's why we name the variable count, because the purpose of the variable is to count the loop. So it's going to start off with 0, because at the top here, notice it's count equals 0. So it's going to be 0 plus 1 the first time the loop runs. So 0 plus 1 gets stored inside of count. That's going to be 1 inside here. Now when the program loops, when the loop repeats itself and it goes back around, the same process. Instead of it being 0, it's now going to be 1 inside of it. Remember, it keeps the old value. Whenever a loop repeats itself, whatever value a variable has in the previous loop, it brings over into the new loop. So count now has a value of 1. It's going to be 1 plus 1. And now 2 gets stored inside of count. And it repeats that pattern over and over for how much ever time the loop runs for. Clear on that?
Yes, sir.
Anybody else? Any other questions from anybody? All right, good. So as I was saying now, the program is set up in such a way that by entering a -1, it's like a kind of like a switch to end the loop. As you know, anytime you enter a -1, it's going to result in a false test and thus end the loop. Now, what happens when you end the loop? Step number 8, we have a simple formula here once again. We take totals, in this case, total as 300. We take count has 2 inside of it, and we divide 300 by 2, average on the left-hand side. So it means that result gets stored into average. And then at step number 9, we display or we print or we output average. So 150 gets output on the screen, and then we end that loop. Are you guys clear on this example here? Have a look at it. Nathan, you clear on it?
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me see if we can pick out the differences. So remember the while loop? The while loop, as we said, has a test at the beginning. So does this have the test at the beginning? Remember the while loop is in this bracket here. The test is at the very beginning here, test here. So is mark not equal to -1? So as soon as the loop starts, even before the loop starts, we have the test at the very beginning. Remember, that's the first characteristic of the while loop. Where's the body? The body, that's after the test. This is the body. So test at the top here, body at the end. As we said here, test at the beginning, body at the end. Now, we already looked at if the test is true, you enter. If it is false, you exit. And you can see that if you constantly enter -1, it has the possibility of never running. So every time you run the program and you enter -1, the program is going to never run. So that's what we mean by having the possibility of never running. Good. That there is the end of while loop. Any questions on the while loop?
You could explain back the fourth step, number 4 for while loop.
Okay, so number 4, having the possibility of never running, meaning the loop you never enter the loop. Remember, the loop has a body, and that's where you want to run out of the loop. And that in this case is total plus mark stored. That's step 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's the body of that loop there. So when you enter the loop, those 4 steps get run. Now, when we mean that the possibility of it never running, we mean that we never carry out these 4 steps. We never run those 4 steps. So what basically happens is that when you reach step 3 and you get false, you jump straight to step 8. You skip them completely. So that's why I said, every time you reach the program, every time you run the program and you reach the loop and a person enters -1 all the time, because remember, -1 is going to give you false. If the person enters -1 every time the program runs, then you're going to get false all the time. And we know that when you get false, you exit that loop. You ignore that loop. So exit or ignore the loop. So in this case here, if we enter -1 all the time, we're going to jump from step 3 all the way to step 8 every time. thus the possibility of it never running.
So if the variable mark had a value of -1, that would have happened.
Right. Because that's gonna lead to a false test. Let me clear up the screen. Okay. So you got to remember this part here. Where is it? You got to remember this part here that I have highlighted on the right hand. The while loop, if the test is true, enter or stay in the loop. If it is false, exit or ignore the loop. That's the condition and the action that needs to be carried out. So in this case here, is mark not equal to -1? So that's why you say ask it in a question format. If we say 60 not equal to -1, is 60 not equal to -1? That's going to be true, because 60 is not equal to -1. Now, if we enter -1, then the condition now of this question is going to be false. This example is a bit tricky to understand because of how they use the not equal. So maybe that's what's throwing you off. But basically, it's asking, is -1 not equal to -1? Let me put it in an easier way. Let me use the equal sign. That might help you to understand it better. So, is 1 equal to 1? Yes. Which is, in this case, true. 1 is equal to 1. So instead of using not equal, let me use the word equal. I usually get that problem every year with the same example. 1 is equal to 1. So we get a condition of true. Now, if we run the test, if we run the question, and we get true, based on our characteristics here, we should know that if we ever get true, we enter the loop. We run the body. Now, if it's ever a false condition, so say for instance, if 2 is entered, and we have to test this, is 2 equal to 1, then we know that is no. 2 is not equal to 1, so that's going to be false. And thus we ignore the loop. Because what do we do when the condition is false? We exit or ignore. Think you understand?
Yes, sir.
Good. Any other questions from anybody? All right, if no questions, let's start our repeat loop. Now, the repeat loop construct repeatedly executes one or more statements as long as the specified condition is false. So we already looked at that. The repeat loop, if the condition is false, stay in the loop. That's what we have here. If the condition is false, stay in the loop. So that's what this paragraph here does indicates. The repeat loop repeatedly executes one or more statements as long as the condition is false. Note that this condition is tested where? At the end of the loop, which we already looked at. The test is at the end of the loop. Now, so the statement will always be executed at least once, which we already covered, has the possibility of running only once or at least once. At least once. What's happening? So it has a possibility of running at least once. Good. So this is the structure. Repeat until. It's two keywords. Like how it has while and then end while. The repeat has repeat until. While, end while, repeat until. That's the pattern. What I forgot to mention is that all of these statements that we're learning about is just for you to understand their structure. Where the test is, where to put the keywords, and you simply copy that structure into whatever you're creating. You copy the same structure. You might just change up the variables. In your case, instead of mark, you put something else. Instead of equal to or not equal to, you put whatever you want, maybe greater than, less than to what? So you follow the same pattern, you follow the same structure, but just that you change your variables, your instructions. All right, so let's look at our first example of the repeat loop. So we have a title here, Pseudocode 16 numbers in a loop. Before we continue, for your SBA, you only need to use one of the three loops. So whichever one you understand the best, if it's the while loop, you understand the best. If it's the repeat loop, you understand the best. If it's the for loop, you understand the best. You put that into your SBA. You just need one loop, one out of the three loops. So the repeat loop, title at the top, numbers in a loop. We have our initialization here. We're initializing a number with a value of 1. It's starting off with 1. Now, the repeat loop is repeat until. So that's how we can know the starting point and the ending point. Repeat until. So, we begin step number 1. We have our update here. So notice, remember we got to look for those 4 parts now. We have our updates. Same pattern, instead of count, we have numbers. If you notice, the structure, the pattern is there. You take a variable, you add 1, and you store it into the same variable. It's the same as before, where you have count plus 1 and store it in the count. You take a variable, add 1, and store it into itself. Same pattern is being carried out here, just using a different variable name. Now, step number 2, output the number is and whatever is inside of that variable called number. So, the phrase, the number is, the number is, and then whatever is inside of that variable. So in this case, it's going to be on the screen, it's going to appear the number is, what will the number be? Let me see if anybody can figure that out. So what will the number be?
2.
2. Very good. Because I didn't do the calculation. So, you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Good. So, remember number is initialized with 1. So that's going to be 1 plus 1. And that means 2 is going to be stored inside of number. So when we reach to step 2, output the number is going to look like this here. The number is 2. Now, it says to repeat until number equals 3. So this here is our test. And that means since we're testing number, that is our variable. What are we missing? There's only three things. We have our update, we have our test, we have our variable. What are we missing?
The body.
The body. Very good. So step 1 and 2 is our body. So notice the 4 parts of this repeat loop: the update, the test, the variable, and the body. But let me run the loop again. So we go back to the top. So now it's going to be, instead of 1 here, it's going to be 2. All right, before we do that, let me go back to the bottom. It says repeat until number equal 3, because we didn't run our test. So let me erase that. Let me erase that. So we get some space. So we ask our question now. Is 2 equal to 3? False. 2 is not equal to 3. What do we do when a repeat loop is false? Anybody remember?
We stay in the loop.
Stay in the loop. Very good. So we stay in the loop. In this case, we repeat the loop. So we go back to the top. 2 plus 1, that's going to be 3. Now 3 gets stored inside of number. If you notice, everything happens in a logical order. Everything happens sequential. It's just carefully going one step after each other, carefully carrying out the action for each step. Everything just happens logically. So 2 plus 1, you get 3. 3 gets now stored inside of number. We go to step 2. We output the number is. So we got to continue this thing at the bottom here. The number is 3. We're now outputting 3. So when we reach the test now, so the test is going to be step number 4. Step number 3. When we reach here now, we're going to ask the question, is 3 equal to 3? So that answer is going to be true. So that means whenever we got true, we exit our loop. So step number 4, we run that and we output out of the loop. So another phrase, out of loop. So this is what will be displayed if we were to run this program here. Any questions on this example? All right, no questions. Now I want you guys to take note of something. When you are creating your pseudocode, this is the pattern you are going to follow when you want to output a statement and a variable at the same time. If you notice, this is the output here from this line of code. Step 2, this is the output. The number is, and 2 appeared on the screen. I think, did I? No. So what is happening? Step 5, output, in quotation mark, the result is space, quotation mark, comma, variable. Now, this here is going to be let me just finish it off so that you could step number 5. Good. I will try to understand what I just typed. So when the first thing, when we want to output a phrase, a sentence, a word, anything, we have to put it in quotation marks, as you can see here. Anything of the sorts, we have to put it in quotation marks. So, like you can see with this example here, the phrase, the result is, with equal sign, yeah, all of that phrase. If you want it to be displayed on the screen, it has to be in quotation mark. That's how we know those words are together. So that's a pattern that we follow. Now, when you want to output a phrase with a variable, you take the phrase, as you would have just learned, you take the phrase with the quotation mark, and then you separate it with a comma, and then you indicate what is the variable you want to be displayed. So in this case, result is that variable. So what's going to happen, this is what the output is going to look like. The result is, and then whatever is inside of equal sign, because I have an equal sign in that quotation mark, the result is equal to 30. Now, if I had notice the amount of space that I place in the quotation mark is the same amount of space will be displayed in the output. So notice there is no space after the equal sign and the quotation mark. Thus, there is no space after the equal sign and the 30. Whatever space you need to include has to be in the quotation marks. So if I had add a space after the equal sign in the output, it would look like that. Equal space 30. Now what would happen if you put the variable in the quotation mark? It's going to be displayed like this here. It's going to treat the variable name like a normal word. It won't have any meaning because it's inside of that quotation mark. So the double quotation mark is used for displaying exactly what is inside of the quotation mark. It doesn't make any changes to it. It doesn't consider anything as a variable, nothing of the sort. Whatever you type in the quotation mark, exactly that will appear on the screen. How much of a space you put in it, exactly that amount of space will display on the screen. So if you ever want to display a phrase, which you will have to, display a phrase with a variable, this is the pattern. Put the phrase in the double quotation mark, and then a comma, then a variable. Now, using this pattern now, we can continue it by adding more phrases and more variables. So if I want maybe the number variable to appear, I could put a comma and type number 1. And in the output, it's going to look like this here. 30, 10. Now, if you notice, even though I have a space here, it's not in the quotation mark. So that's why I won't get any space in my output. If I do want a space, I would need to add that space with the quotation mark. So I would need to add quotation mark, space, quotation mark, comma. So what's happening here right now, and then I'll get a space there, what's happening here is that the comma is my separator here, separating phrase from variable. So that's what you need to remember here. So whatever's in this quotation mark gets displayed. The comma indicates the end. The variable, whatever's inside of it, gets displayed. The comma indicates the end once again. Two quotation mark. Whatever is inside of it will be displayed. In this case, it's one single space. Here's a bonus question. Is a space a character? Is space a character? Yes, no, maybe. Samir says no. Anybody else?
Yes.
Stephanie says yes. Let me get a tiebreaker. One person said yes, one person said no. One more person, yes or no? Yes, and the correct answer is yes. Space is a character. Space is identified as a character. It identifies as a character. So, how much of a space we put inside of this quotation mark will appear, that exact amount. So, I'm just going to copy it over. That exact amount. So if you notice there, I can even copy space. How many of you know you can actually copy space? Yeah, that's a possibility. Because space is a character. Just that it's not showing anything. So, once again, the pattern, whatever is in the quotation mark, exactly that will appear. You just got to type a variable name by itself, and the content of that variable will be displayed. And everything gets separated by commas. Any questions? All right, no questions. Let's move on. Let's look at another example of the repeat loop. So we have a title here, attend classes. We have an input, step 1. Notice this one here doesn't have a prompt. It's just straight to the input. Poor design. So input a day. We got input Sunday. So repeat output, attend classes. So step number 2. So this gets displayed on the screen, attend classes. It's telling you to attend classes. Step number 3, repeat until day equals weekend day. So day in this case is going to be Sunday equal weekend day. So we ask it in a question format. Is Sunday a weekend day? That's going to be true. Sunday is a weekend day. What do we do when the repeat loop is true? Do we exit or we stay?
We exit.
We exit. Very good. So we end the loop there. We're done. Now, if we had, so that's just a simple example there. So if we had entered Friday, we get displayed on the screen at 10 classes. So this here could be a case of when we entered Sunday there, at 10 classes displayed on the screen. Maybe you want every time the person run the program, maybe a student running the program, every time they run the program, the instruction appears on the screen at 10 classes. Every time they run the program, at 10 classes. A constant reminder to that person at 10 classes. So that's just an example there of running something every time the program runs. No matter if the person enters a test whereby it's going to exit the loop, that same phrase is going to run every single time they run the program. 10 classes. So in this case, the person enters Friday. Step number 2, 10 classes. Then we run the test. Step number 3 is Friday, a weekend day. Then that's going to be false. And we just go back to the top and we repeat that over and over until we enter that weekend day and we get through. Any questions on this one?
No, sir.
Lena, you good so far?
Yes, sir.
All right, another example. Pseudocode. Title, attend classes. Input day. Friday. That's step 1. Step 2, we output, do not go to school. So they're telling you straight off, do not go to school. Step number 3, if you enter Friday, repeat until it is a school day. So is Friday equal to it being a school day? Then that is true. Friday is a school day.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I have a question. So you see how they're saying output do not go until it is a school day. I was thinking, isn't then you have to like I know it's just the part you're talking about the loop, right? But we have to also declare the different days and say whether it's a school day or not, so that when you have the loop now, you could refer to that and know if the day is a school day or not to put do not go to school or not.
All right. So that would be done for the program. But since this is a pseudocode, we're just simplifying the instructions. Remember, this is a guide as to how to create the program. So in the program, we're going to do all of that. But in this case here, this is just the instructions telling the person how to create it in the program. You understand?
Yes, sir. Yeah, because I was thinking of it in the perspective that you have to be specific with the computer for it to refer to things and know this is how it should deploy the code or run the code.
Yeah, all that. You are correct, but that's for the programming aspects. But this is just the blueprint that we're creating for them to create that. But I don't know how much sense this example here makes, because when the repeat loop is true, we are supposed to exit the loop. So in this case, Friday is a school day, so we're supposed to exit. So I don't know why they're telling you do not go to school on a Friday, unless you're not supposed to go to school on a Friday. Okay. Moving on from this example. All right, let's look at this one. So pseudocode title on the 20, we have initialization here. Now note that initialization could also be considered a step. So we could technically start counting step 1 from here. But initialization is usually be carried out once. So it all depends. Step 1, we store 18 inside of age. Step 2, we enter our repeat loop. We output, you are under 20 years old. So this phrase got output in the screen. Notice the quotation marks, the phrase. Step number 3, we carry out our updates. 18 plus 1, going to give us 19. Repeat until age is equal to 20. Then we ask our question, is 19 equal to 20? False. And when we have a false, we have to stay inside of the loop. So we go back to the top. Step 2, you are under 20 years old. Then we go back here. 19 plus 1 gives us 20. Is 20 equal to 20? True. And we exit. Any questions on this one?
Sir, I was thinking, do what do you call service providers use this in application? Like there's products that have a age cutoff, and you would have to give some personal information. And when your birthday is, and let's say up to a certain age, you can't use it anymore. Do they like use this and they check your age and until when you meet them, then you might get a notification and say you're this age and you can't use the product
Yep.
anymore.
Yep, that's correct. So in this case here, remember the information might be stored in a database. So remember when we learned about database, we use Microsoft Access. And in Access, a part of Access we did not look at is the macros. And then there's also SQL. So the purpose of macros is to basically write different coding instructions. And there's even an option to incorporate SQL, whereby you can type in certain codes, programming codes, and so on. So alongside the database, you can have a program instruction like this here being carried out, because the information is in the database and you correspond it. The program now is going to check the database and run the instruction. All right, our
Sir, do you know an example of a company that would do this?
most companies, any company, NIS, because GRA, yeah, those are just local examples. And more than likely, most foreign-based companies would also make use of it, Teleperformance and well, that's local also, but other major companies would make use of it.
Guess
They have database services set up. All right, our final example of the repeat loop. Next week, we are going to look at the for loop, the final loop. So, title, average of exam marks using repeat loop. We have initialization there, count equals 0, another one, another one. This is similar to the while loop, the example we looked at the beginning. Repeat until. So repeat until, that's our starting point and our ending point. Step 1, display enter mark, that's our prompt. The person has to enter a mark at step 2. Say we enter 80. Now, notice we have an if here. What was I gonna ask? Anyway, I forgot what was I gonna ask. So notice in the body of the repeat loop, we have an if statement. So if, then, else. If, then, else. So this is where, see how I'm bracketing all of these things? That can help you to know the starting point and the ending point. Remember we talked about indentation? This here is these two steps here is part of the else. So if mark is equal to -1, so this example here is a bit complicated. It has a lot of actions being carried out. So when the person enters 80, at step number 3, we start the if function inside the loop. We're running a test. If mark is equal to -1, so now we have to know if to run the then or the else part of this if statement. So we ask the question, is 80 equal to -1? False. Because 80 is not equal to -1. Now, step number 4, step number 5, step number 6. Seeing that the condition is false, what is our next step? Let me see who remembers the if statement.
Sir, would you go to else? No. Hold on, let me think about all this.
Can you repeat? Or anybody else? Would we start with step number 4? Would we start with step number 5? Would we start with step number 6? Which one?
Sir, I believe we start at step number 5.
And you are correct. So we would have looked at the if statement, and the then keyword is for true, and the else keyword is for false. These simple things y'all need to remember. We only carry out the then statements if the test is true. We only carry out the else statements if the test is false. So in this case here, we have to ignore this true statement and we go to the false statement. So step number 5 is our next step. We take total. What's inside of total? 0. 0 plus whatever's inside of mark, that's 80. 80 gets stored inside of mark. Anybody not following so far? Anybody not following so far? All right. Step number 6 was inside of count. 0 is inside of count. 0 plus 1. That's going to be 1 inside of count. Then we go on to the until. So now we're testing to see if we should remain in the loop or not. Is mark equal to -1? That is false. What do we do when the repeat loop is false? Anybody?
So we stay in the function, we stay in the loop.
We stay inside of the loop. So we go back to the top. The person has to enter a mark. We go to step 1, display, enter a mark. Step 2, input mark. So the person now has to input a mark. We now input 120. All right, there's no such mark as 120. We input 60. So we go back to the test now. Step number 3. Is 60 equal to -1? That's false once again. So we ignore step number 4 again. We go on to step number 5 because that's the else part, looking at the false. So it's now going to be 80, because remember total at 80 from the previous loop, with the 60 from this current entry. 80 plus 60 is going to give us 140. Now count has a 1 inside of it now. So 1 plus 1 is going to give us 2. And then we go back to the bottom. Is 60 equal to negative 1? We get false once again, and we go back to the top. So now, once again, the mechanism of negative 1 is used for ending the program, ending the loop. So when the person now enters at negative 1, we can run the test. Is negative 1 equal to negative 1? That's going to be true. Now remember, we at step number 3, so we got to know whether to run what part of this if statement. So we ignore the else. I want to scratch it because we got to see the values later. And we run step number 4. So step 5 and 6 gets ignored, and we run step number 4 now because now the condition is true. So display end of marks. Can we finish entering the marks now? So since we run step number 4, we ignore 5 and 6. This is supposed to be step 7. Now we got to know if to continue in the loop. Is negative 1 equal to negative 1? That's true. And whenever repeat is true, we exit. So we reach another if. If, then else. If count equals 0. So we look for count. Is 2 equal to 0? False. 2 is not equal to 0. So that's step number 8, step number 9, step number 10, step number 11. The condition is false. That means we have to ignore the true statement. And we jump to step number 10, where we carry out the calculation of average. We take total, which is 140. We divide it by how much is in count. That's 2. 140 divided by 2 is going to give us 70. 70 gets stored into average, and then we output average. So 70 gets output on the screen. Any questions from anybody?
Sir, it's not a question but a comment. I understand what you have to do at the parts, but if you look at it and try to like apply it in real life, like try to find some way, like maybe a teacher, an IT teacher would do them to help them calculate marks. I don't get the sense, sir.
You don't get the sense? I mean,
Like a reason behind doing this.
yeah, it's the same for me. I won't create a program just calculating grades. Like doing it in Excel is a bit better because you get the information there, you see it visually and so on. But I guess think of it like maybe a student wants to calculate their information. So instead of doing it manually on a calculator, they just enter the information into the program. Or maybe it's just a quick output. You have a program there ready for if you want a quick output as to what's the person's average and so on. Either way, so but with that in mind, that's it for the repeat loop. What's going to really help you guys to understand these loops is if you go through these two examples here in your own free time. This same example 20 that we looked at, and for the while loop, this example 15 here. Go through them in your spare time. That's going to help you to understand clearly, and it's going to help you to practice tracing also, because that's going to be important for your exam when you have to trace your programs. Good. To recap what we looked at, it's basically for you to remember the differences between the while and the repeat loop, the parts of a loop. We looked at that there are two types of loops, indefinite and definite, and which is which. While and repeat are indefinite loops. And next week we're going to look at the definite, which is the for loop. Any questions before we close?
No, sir.
Any questions from anybody else?
No, sir.
All right, if no questions from anyone, that will be the end of today's class. Please remember to also complete the other parts of your SBA. From Monday, we please bring your work for me to check so we can work on them, try to finalize them. That's it. If nothing else, that's the end of today's class. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, sir. Monday if the Venezuelans don't attack.
Sure.